The case against Google in Europe, the antitrust case, may well be reaching a climax. And in Silicon Valley, there's no one who knows more, perhaps, about government antitrust cases than my guest today, Gary Reback, who was very much involved in the government case against Microsoft, the antitrust case, 10 or 15 years ago. Gary, welcome to TechCrunch TV.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Gary, before we get on to Google, what was your involvement on the Microsoft case?
Well, that consumed 10 or 15 years of my life, to tell you the truth. I think it would be fair to say I'm generally credited with spearheading the effort to get the U.S. government to sue Microsoft, which eventually they did successfully, and that, frankly, paved the way for Google.
You happy you did that? Was that beneficial for everyone, for competition?
I think that Silicon Valley generally views it as a very beneficial set of events.
Would it be fair, one of the things I've heard about the case both in the US and Europe against Google is that the experience of the Microsoft case made governments much warier of going after Google?
I don't know about that. I think that the experience of the Microsoft case made Google much more savvy about how to deal with the government. You recall that Microsoft was really tough publicly, but Google has taken a softer public line, both publicly and with the governments. They haven't precipitated a lawsuit in the way that Microsoft did, and that's made them sort of more successful in negotiating with the governments.
Gary, before we get into the specifics of the case, very broadly, what is the antitrust case, particularly in Europe, but also in the US against Google?
The case is a monopolization case, as we would use U.S. terminology.
But monopolies aren't illegal, are they?
Monopolies by themselves are not illegal. However, if you did illegal things to get a monopoly, or you do illegal things to maintain a monopoly, that's illegal. Now, it's easier, I think, to talk about this using European terminology. The issue in Europe is whether, first, Google has a dominant position in search, which they do. They've had in excess of 90% share for many years.
Larger than in the US?
Significantly larger than in the US, at least as counted by some of the services. Other services put them about the same level. But then the second question is, have they abused that dominance? And the charge here is by manipulating search results to preference their own results over those of specialty search engine competitors, that they have abused their dominance. So that's the principal issue on the table.
Do you think it's a fair accusation?
I think it's not only fair, it's eminently provable. And in fact...
Well, that's a pretty radical thing to say.
Oh, I don't think so. Where we are in Europe, the European government, what's called the European Commission, has filed a public document. They say preliminarily they've decided that Google is dominant and has abused its dominant position. They say preliminarily they've decided that Google has preferenced its own results in a way that's not fair and not disclosed to consumers.
Cheating.
Well, they don't.
Or at least breaking the law.
They don't use those words, but they do say in violation of several of the articles forming the European Union. And they've asked Google what Google intends to do about that before they sue them.
And
so
does Google acknowledge guilt here?
No. No, Google doesn't acknowledge guilt, but they have made a proposal back to the European Commission saying, we'll be willing to do these kinds of things if that suffices to get the matter resolved.
Why is the case in the US being dropped by the FTC?
Well, I think that's a matter of viewpoint. My viewpoint is that Google is very well politically connected to the Obama administration and in Washington more generally. And there wasn't anyone who perceived a great career path in challenging Google and the Federal Trade Commission.
That's a pretty controversial thing to say, Gary. You mean that Google is so powerful in D.C. that the government was scared to take the case against it?
Yes. I think that, and by the way, you asked me my viewpoint, and that's my viewpoint.
Right.
And others might disagree. You know, there's been a lot of controversy following the FTC's, in effect, just dropping the case. There's been controversy in all the major news publications, not just by me, and not just by Republicans, but by other Democrats
well,
as well.
You're pretty kosher in the sense that you also took the case against Microsoft, so no one can accuse you of working for one camp or another.
Right. It's not like I'm playing favorites. You know, my whole background is helping Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and young companies. I mean, I've represented so many of Silicon Valley companies when they're young.
So from your point of view, is this antitrust issue, is it bad for our entrepreneurs out there, startup guys who are wanting to do something interesting, just like Larry and Sergey tried to do 13 years ago?
You know, that is exactly the key question. We had to back Bill Gates off so that Larry and Sergey had their opportunity at market. And now we're going to have to do the same thing with Larry and Sergey. I mean, if I were advising an entrepreneur these days, I wouldn't tell him to do anything in search. I wouldn't tell him to get anywhere near the Google platform because it's an invitation for Google to just roll right over you whenever they wish.
Why are Google spending so much money in DC? I saw some numbers that
staggering
suggested
numbers.
that they're outspending, I think, almost any other corporation in the US.
Yeah, well, they're getting great results, aren't they?
How much are they spending?
I don't remember the press numbers, but they're in the tens of millions, as I recall.
And beating, what, the GEs and the Lockheeds and the AT&Ts of the world?
Yes, and you know, we don't even really have good overall numbers because of the way these things are calculated. I mean, corporate contributions are calculated in a certain way, but there have been, back before the last election, a number of high-profile fundraisers in Silicon Valley, in effect sponsored by Google people.
Is Obama in Google's pocket?
Well, I don't want to go as, even though I've been daring on your show here, I don't want to go that far. I don't know whether the president is actually
half
thinking
in the
about,
pocket.
Well, I'm not going to go there.
So at the moment, on the U.S. front, the antitrust case is dead. Maybe it will be resurrected. What about in Europe, though? What's the situation?
Yeah. We should come back to the U.S. at the end, but in Europe, the situation is quite active. Google has been under investigation now for 3 years in Europe, longer than in the United States. And there are many more complaints filed against them by consumer groups, by coalitions of companies, by publishers, by lots and lots of European interests with the backing of their national governments, like, say, the government of France, for example. And so the situation, I think, from Google's perspective, is far more serious. And the preliminary views of the Commission, as stated, are problematic for Google, and the issue is now whether the Commission will accept Google's proposal to resolve the charges against it.
Are we getting close to a climax on this? I mean, can we expect a resolution, say, by the end of the year?
I think that perhaps, we are at a very key point.
Perhaps is not a good answer from a lawyer.
Well, if I could give you a better one, I would, simply for the following reason. I think Google would like to have this resolved by the end of the year.
Well, as long as they win, right?
Well, as long as they can get out of this without making any serious commitments that damage their market position, affect their profitability, you know, those kinds of things. That's what they're interested in. The other people who are opposing them are interested in having remedies that actually level the playing field, which they don't feel they're getting right now.
For our entrepreneurial audience. How much damage can Europe do to Google if they really went after them?
Well, I think if you go back to the Microsoft situation, it's a fair statement to say that it was the Europeans that disciplined Microsoft and not the United States government. We went through a long trial with Microsoft. That was particularly informative. It informed everything else that happened. However, Europe then brought down the hammer on Microsoft, fining them billions and billions of euros and promising more fines unless they stopped doing what they were doing. So that is a possibility.
But does Almunia have the stomach for a fight? They say that he doesn't, not like, who was the person who took
Neelie Kroes.
So do they need another woman in charge to really go after Google?
Before Neelie Kroes, there was a man in charge named Mario Monti, who's recently been the premier of Italy. Very smart guy, also an aggressive antitrust enforcer. I've never met Mr. Almunia.
But if he's watching, what's your advice to Almunia? I'm sure he is, because everyone in Europe watches TechCrunch. What would you say to him?
I would say that if he wants to go down, I think he has said this will be his last public position. He's a Spanish socialist. If he wants to go down...
Is that a contradiction in terms?
I'm not quite sure. Not knowing enough about European government. But if he wants to go down in European history and lore as being someone who did something important, then he needs to do more than he's doing right now.
Well, Chairman Almunia, if you're watching, listen to the great Gary Reback. And very finally, Gary, 30 seconds, what should happen in the US? If the new chairman of the FTC is watching, what advice would you give?
I've given her plenty of advice, even when she was not watching your show. I think my preference would be she cedes the Google matter to the United States Department of Justice because they're better equipped to handle it. And she goes back to doing whatever else the FTC wants to do. It was the Justice Department that went after Microsoft, not the Federal Trade Commission. I think that there are really severe institutional issues in the Federal Trade Commission. I don't expect her to start there. I expect that there'll be now a follow-on case against Google, but on a more minor sector. There'll be some actions against Google on privacy disclosure issues, and we'll see where that goes. And I would expect that within the next several months.
Well, Gary, we'll have you back on privacy, but thank you for making the law comprehensible, and I look forward to talking to you again about privacy, and I'm sure in the next 10 or 15 years some of these issues will be resolved. Gary Reback, thanks for appearing on TechCrunch TV.
Thank you so much.